Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of April, 2024 year. A lot of events have happened today, very interesting events. So let's get started. And we will probably start with you from the busiest, most important direction. This is, of course, the Okrutinsky direction, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation, despite, say, problems, difficulties, perhaps even an incomprehensible configuration of the offensive, continue to advance, continue to develop success, continue to displace the armed forces of Ukraine from their occupied positions. VTIAS has a large number of icons, and of course, they should all pay attention and discuss everything. For example, here again, let's start with you with a topographic map, which generally shows the strategic importance of this direction. The Q is located exactly at the highest point of the direction, at a strategic height, the capture of which will certainly open up for Russian troops, the Russian command simply indescribable superiority. And let's say some bonuses compared to the Ukrainian positions that are located around this hill. And today, for example, information is already being received from very reliable pro-Ukrainian resources. Geocenters, those who are engaged in geolocation, just like you and me on the Military Reports channel, and determines everything, but specifically, clearly from the Ukrainian side, have their own insights, have their own connections with the brigades, receives videos directly from the primary sources themselves. And now they have already published and reported that the next one is under the full control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So far, we have not had any geolocations confirming this information, but the control is actually significant. The control is substantial. The armed forces of Ukraine continue to retreat, unable to stabilize the situation. Today, very contradictory news was received, sometimes some of which even reached some kind of absurdity, including from Ukrainian sources, such as there has connections on the ground and generally owns some kind of situation. That is, according to Ukrainian sources, here is the real configuration, the real map, what you see before your eyes is approximately the territory under which the armed forces of the Russian Federation are under control. Significant success, significant progress. And then there is information that the Ukrainians are retreating. And of course the main responsibility for defeat in this direction lies on the shoulders of the 115th Mechanized Brigade, which again sources report that there is generally no fault with ordinary soldiers here. They did not retreat, but at some point there was some kind of disorganization, misunderstanding between the command of the 115th Brigade and the fighters on the ground as a whole, and that forced the latter to essentially abandon their positions and retreat. The Ukrainian command informs about the rotation in Novoalexandrov in the Bakhmutovka cinema, although again it is reported that in fact there is no rotation. It's just trying to somehow disguise the very retreat and flight from the battlefield. Also, sources report paying attention in general to a locality called Arkhangelsk. This is the next locality, which is located north of the locality of the Q. And now it is reported that Arkhangelsk, due to some difficulties with the complexity of the terrain, it is reported that the settlement is directly connected, has only two connections with the settlement of Osheratina, and has a connection with the settlement, let's say, well, the ceramics Novokalinova agglomeration. And in general, in the event of a further offensive, that is, in fact, the settlement is already cut off from the mainland. Since there are no messages or messages at an extremely low level, then in general, it is possible that the Russian army will try in the near future, if the situation in Konstantino is developing so successfully, and try to storm the settlement of Arkhangelsk, including after, of course, it is possible to clean up the final completion of the battle for the settlement of Novokalinovi Ceramic. If we talk about Novokalin ceramics, it is reported that after all, the Russian army was physically able to cut the Route 0544, ceramics, Novokalinov, then, let's say, Alexandropol, which flows into the M20 highway, and as of today, sources report pro-Ukrainian, which deep state, You are probably familiar with this mapping service. That's an approximate control of the Russian army in this direction. In general, it is safe to say that Ceramics and Novokalinova, where very fierce events are taking place now, which are very real in the slang of Zaruba, but as if the fighting does not stop for a second. The settlements have fallen into an operational environment. Since all the paths have been under fire control for a long time, it is most likely possible to retreat north through the fields. But this is not quite possible conveniently. But it's hard to say in this area has not happened. But again, in Arkhangelsk, despite the fact that the point has, say, a connection with Cheratin and Ceramics, there is still a certain, let's say, settlement road further north towards the settlement of Kalinova. And here, although despite the fact that the highway breaks, that is, the village road is cut, ends in some area. For sure it has been trampled here for a long time, and in general, this connection is still present. In particular, pay attention to a fairly extensive developed network of strong points. At least around Arkhangelsk, there are 3 company strong points, one in the west here, one in the south, it is on the highway. That the streets are leveled between Osheretino and Ceramics 1, right to the south of Kalinov. That is, 3 pillars, a fairly powerful fortified area, and it will not be so easy to storm it. And despite the fact that, let's say, despite the bravura statements of individual military experts. Now let's move on to the southern direction. You see, there are also a large number of icons, a large number of flags, which suggests that there were probably some messages about further progress. It all started in the morning, and it is reported that, as we did yesterday, the story continued, that the Russian army continued its offensive into the settlement of Novobakhmutovka, and as of today, the control of Novobakhmutovka is 3/4, let's say, of the settlement. This information was received today during the day. If we talk about cartographers, then all pro-Ukrainian cartographers, neutral and pro-Russian cartographers, without exception, claim that during the offensive operation, or rather during the most likely retreat operation from the side of the USU, the Russian army managed to establish control, including in this area. That is, at the moment we see with you the flower of Osheretin, you can even call it that. And we see with you that the flower of the mountain begins its flowering. He's starting to blossom. And how it will flourish is extremely impossible to predict. And a further offensive can go in general in all directions. In principle, like a flower, it blooms along, say, 360 degrees of direction. And already today, several very interesting reports have been received that Russian troops, in principle, have already begun to probe and make the first attempts to enter the settlement of Solovyev. And Ukrainian sources report that Solovyev has either already begun evacuation, or is already in the process of evacuation, or has long since left the settlement of Ukrainian fighters in the direction of the village of Sokol, Voskhod, Yevgenyevka, and then the village of Progress. In other words, there is already an extremely high desire, a great desire, to paint the Solovyev settlement at least in the gray zone. Since it is very likely that this is the situation that exists here on Earth right now. Of the interesting things, it is worth noting some kind of stuffing from Ukrainian sources, to be more precise, again, deep state. And according to them, according to their information, Russian troops, among other things, attempted an offensive towards the settlement of Progress. But again, the settlement of Progress is very far from, say, the same Osheretina. And it is difficult to imagine how it was possible to overcome it all, but I, as I understand it, meant an attempt to attack the west along the railway. And most likely, according to Ukrainian sources, this attack was repulsed with the help of the 100th Brigade of the Mechanized Brigade, which, apparently, transferred the Skopinski direction, because they were last seen in the Kremeni forests. And in all likelihood, somewhere the offensive of this brigade of Russian troops was stopped along this line. Somewhere here, most likely, this offensive has stopped. Again, I repeat, for the very second time in a row over the past day. Extremely contradictory information about the settlement of Novo-Alexandrovka has been received. Just yesterday, it was reported that the settlement was left by the AFU fighters. Today this information is coming. This city is on the same, let's say, in the same sentence with the locality of Osheratina in terms of conversations about rotation, retreat, and abandonment of settlements. Therefore, it is difficult to guess what is going on. But again, you need to understand what will happen next, how the situation will develop further. And if we take the Okrutinsky direction directly, and the idea of how the offensive can move further, then first of all, of course, it is worth paying attention to the barriers that the Russian army will face. And the first barrier is, of course, water barriers, a network of reservoirs, Stavkov, a network of rivers, which, let's say, goes along the street of the settlements of Sokol, Yevgenyevka, and then the Vovchi River, after which the Mazova River goes after the Vovchi River, and, let's say, this water barrier flows into the Charles Reservoir. This is the first water barrier, and it is quite significant, very conveniently located for defense. The next water barrier comes from the village of Solovyev. Then, after Solovyev, Novopokrovskaya, after Novopokrovsky, there is the settlement Novoselovka the first. And after Novoselovka the first again flows into the Charles Reservoir. In other words, we see that, in general, stepping into this pocket is extremely inconvenient, extremely unprofitable. And even if the APU retreats from the settlement of Solovyev, then they will probably move further either to Sokol, or to move to the people's stronghold, located between Novoselovka first and the same point of Sokol. That is, we can say with confidence that there is an extremely difficult to overcome line of defense, which goes exactly from the Falcon, from one strong point, located, let's say, in the bend of the river. Here and in the bend of this beam, or as in a single water barrier, and further south, Novoselovka is the first and closes again. The same company stronghold. That is, perhaps for the same reason, in order to save the lives of the personnel, and in general. It is even possible to warm up the panic, and somehow inspire the Russian fighters to egg. We go further, and these, let's say, unplanned, read in quotation marks, retreats of the armed forces of Ukraine, deep into very protected, and, let's say, fortified areas are taking place. Then let's look now to the north, along the Novo-Alexandrovka-Kalinova line, and here is the settlement of Arkhangelsk. What do we have here? A similar story. First of all, a network of water barriers to a network of different rates, different rivers, which goes, let's say. Along this line, the Arkhangelsk one passes from the west-northwest, then goes through a network of water utilities, and through a network of reservoirs to Kalinova. That is, a significant water barrier, which is also not so easy to overcome. I remind you that the Russian army reached Orlovka and Berdik very easily, but it took a very long time to overcome this Zeryansky, the bad river. It was very difficult to overcome it. And in general, Russian troops were able to overcome it along the railway, trying to bypass it. In other words, in fact, we can say that the defense along the Durnaya River fell after the Russian troops bypassed the Berdiks of the north. That is, after that, on the whole, the expediency on the part of the APU to defend it disappeared. And again, if we return ceramics with you, then there is a similar situation here. There is a small, let's say, water barriers again, let's say a reservoir, and they go further in the direction of Old Nikolaevka. That is, Kalinova again. In other words, we see a similar story. Two rivers, closing, merging into the Charles Reservoir. Here, similarly, there are two networks of, let's say, water barriers, which then merge together, closer to the Old Nikolaevka. Here, too, it is not very convenient to attack, but we see with you, perhaps the map is already outdated. There are some networks of strong points, but there is no point in attacking here in principle. There are only fields here and here. Well, maybe you will not get anywhere. And for sure, there are hardly any plans to attack somewhere in the artillery pocket. Yes, and the Russian army has a fairly high chance of taking control of Arkhangelsk, after all. It is located on the Russian side of these water barriers, And, in fact, Arkhangelsk smoothly, so to speak, flows into Osheratina. So I don't see any barriers here for the offensive of the Russian army. And for sure, the alignment of the front and access to the water barriers will be present here in the near future, including in the village of Karamik. Here the offensive is obvious, it will be passed, and it will surely be completed, even despite the network of strong points. But further on, after leveling along Arkhangelsk, along Ceramics, along Novokalyovo, south of Solovyev, what will the Russian army do next? And here, of course, the big question is where to move, because the nearest points, the nearest settlements are the Progress settlement, where today Ukrainian sources reported about some kind of progress that was stopped in the 100th Brigade, and Novoalexandrovka. Here, of course, the situation is not very, let's say, simple. The thing is that even if we calculate the distance across open fields, how can the Russian army advance? Then from Pristina to Novoalexandrovka, on the roads that are present here, the distance is a little less than 6 kilometers. If we take a new Osheratina with you, and then move on to Progress, then the distance will be up to the first houses in the area of 8 kilometers. In fact, in the conditions of FP buckets, in the conditions of point artillery, in the conditions of all these types of weapons, these are insurmountable distances. This is an insurmountable distance for, let's say, another column of armored vehicles consisting of 2 or 3 tanks, with 2 tanks with minesweepers and 3 or 4 Beks with troops there. These are insurmountable distances. It's very difficult, at least. But again, we are talking in a situation when the APU is doing well with supplies, when there is rotation, when there are fresh weapons, drones, equipment, Bradley fresh only from the factory. This is the situation that is now in the Ukrainian army. Perhaps these distances will be easy to overcome. I can't say, I can't answer. We are just looking at what is present here and what difficulties the Russian army may face with a further offensive. It is very interesting and very worth noting that despite such significant progress in the Cheretinsky direction, we see that the armed forces are still just clinging to the Berdicks with their nails. For what reason they are so fiercely holding on to this village, I cannot yet find an answer. But here we see a certain operational scope. Perhaps there is such a situation that there are no company strongpoints on this operational expanse between the Charles Reservoir, Novoselovka, Pervaya, Novopokrovsky, Berdik, and Semenovka. There are some small trenches there, which, in fact, the Russian army will not see, will not even feel when it begins to pile on them with all its military might. And in general, these settlements can allow the Russian army to easily continue to storm the fields in the direction of Novoselovka first. And then this line of defense, this small pocket, it will certainly collapse. It will collapse as much as possible, since supplies will be cut off, and perhaps it is from here that the further offensive will go. It may be for this reason that the AFU is trying with all its might, to hold the defense line of Novopokrovskaya Novoselovka First Umanskaya, that is, along a small country road of supply, between 2 settlements. It is the battle in Berdik that is exactly the battle for this line, in order to prevent the Russian army from crossing it. But here I don't see such serious barriers. After overcoming Berdik and Semenovka of these water barriers, the valley will continue to be one field, and here in fact, well, it will be much easier. This is an operational space, and it will be possible for the Russian army to attack much easier here. This is the kind of story we are witnessing. A difficult moment, a difficult geography. Despite the control of the main height, there are still water obstacles, there is a distance. There is this gap that needs to be overcome. But surely now, it is the Russian command that is thinking about the further plan. And again, please note, if we are talking with you about the outline, there are no geolocations in front of the screens. Indeed, it was I who drew attention to this today, that they do not publish the high strikes of the 47th Brigades there, which are full in this direction. And the main blows are still being laid on Semenovka and Berdik, again of the 47th Brigade. Why is this particular direction given such a high protest of the Afu country? I can't give you an answer to this question, but again, I repeat, from my assumption. They are afraid of losing the Novoselovka-First-Manskaya highway, because this can lead to the collapse of everything from Novoalexandrovka, Progress, and other settlements. This turned out to be a much more important direction for the Apu than the strategic height in the locality of Osheratina. Well, despite the situation here, we are moving further south with you, and of course we come to Krasnogorovka. There are a few geolocations and a few frames in Krasnogorovka. To be more precise, there are no frames at all. Here is footage of the evacuation of a damaged turtle tank, which was knocked out during the next offensive. And it may have just lost its course, and in any case it was evacuated and brought out, say, to repair stations. But the most important thing that comes from all sources today is that the Russian army, if, let's say, we are saying now that Russia is at the offensive stage of launching its greatest grandiose offensive on the territory of Ukraine, and if, let's say, we talk about all the other directions Kapitsky, Kharkov, Zaporozhye, South Donetsk, if the Russian army has not yet launched its greatest offensive there, then if we talk in particular about Krasnogorka, then it began here. Today it is reported that everything that could fly was flying here today. Everything in a huge amount was simply equaled by the Red Army in a way that no locality had ever equaled before. During artillery training, everything so big, explosive and powerful arrives here that even when Avdiivka began training in the 20s and 10th of October, there was no such thing even here. Of course, I have not seen, heard, or watched, but this is exactly the news that is coming today from the Krasnogorsk direction. In other words, it can be concluded, if this information is confirmed by both Ross and Ukrainian sources, and everyone agrees. And everyone says that right now there's a battle for the central part, for this brick factory, what is it called? Krasnogorovsky, to the refractory plant. It is for this central part that the battle is being waged, and the Russian army has moved into decisive and final assault on this area. And of course, as we have discussed many times, if we manage to take control of the central part, Krasnogorovka will fall down. Everything, the eastern Tukrip district, which has been under construction since the 2014 year, is all a network that is simply visible even from a satellite. These trenches, all of this will be unnecessary. They won't even stand here for one day. The Ukrainian fighters will not just leave their positions. To be more precise, in my opinion, there are 59 standing here. And they will just start rolling back massively to this Charles Reservoir. That is, we are watching, waiting. Probably this night. There will be big fights here and tomorrow morning, and already midnight, to receive full-fledged information. St. George's direction. There are no video frames. There are only shots from various pro-Ukrainian neutral cartographers who claim that during the fighting, the Russian managed to enter the gray zone, level the front line, and, in general, at the moment establish control over approximately this area. Significant progress, however, and for now the western and southern part of the George farm is under control in the forest. The counter-battery struggle continues, during which, again, several artillery installations have been successfully suppressed and destroyed by the Russian army over the past day. Novomikhailovka. For today, we have only one geolocation, more precisely, the geolocation of one post from the 79th Mechanized Brigade. They published information today that, in general, the Russian army did not wait, rest, carry out any rotation activities. Operational pauses. The movement began as quickly as possible, instantly, and the Russian army began to advance further. But Ukrainians note that the tactics of the Russian army's use of equipment, troops, and offensives have changed. And something new has happened. Either the command changed, or indeed after the new Mikhailovka was taken by fighters with the same 155th and 155th, perhaps some related units, they went on rotation. Fresh forces were brought here, which began to apply a completely new approach to the offensive. Ukrainians note that Russian troops have begun to use, let's say, motorized stormtroopers more and more often in this direction. In other words, they stopped using heavy machinery. If you use heavy equipment, it is only exclusively armored as much as possible with the latest versions. Riba Frera is there with everything possible to suppress drones so that they just fall, possibly near Kiev. Here we take off near Kiev, and the equipment turns on under Novomikhailev, it just falls there. That is so powerful. And the Ukrainians say that it has become so difficult for him to incite them to the 79th Brigade responsibility for the defense of the directions. It has become very extremely difficult to incite heavy equipment, but in addition to heavy equipment, Russian troops have begun to use breakthroughs using motorcycles as often as possible. That is, it overcomes large fields on maneuverable vehicles. To fighters on a motorcycle, there are 4 or 5 motorcycles, 10 stormtroopers fly into land. Take a small stronghold there of 2 or 3 people and organize defense there, wait for the Afu counteroffensive, repel it. And this time these heavy tanks, heavy equipment, which cannot be knocked out, are pulling from behind. Very interesting technique, tactics. It is the Apu that informs that by using this tactic, the Russian troops managed to make significant progress, take several strong points right off the bat, and without the opportunity to attack and either repel them. The Russian army continues to prepare a springboard for further offensive operations. The settlement is under heavy artillery fire, the fire of multiple launch rocket systems. The clearing of forest belts, supports, trenches, everything around is underway. And this, in fact, is also one of the key areas at the moment, and one of the areas where the greatest number of geolocations associated with artillery strikes, multiple launch rocket systems, drones, fabs are found. Everything is flying here, and unequivocally, the Russian army will soon begin an assault and another attempt at an offensive in this direction. It's hard to say. It will be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, before the May holidays, after the May holidays. But this operation will be carried out as soon as possible. Perhaps as soon as the Russian army manages to physically cut the highway T-0524 Konstantinovka, and in fact cut off, or rather not completely, but partially bring down the logistics of the Apu in Ugledar. Then the influx of fresh air will probably begin, and the offensive will begin. Then we will go back slightly in the direction of the chapel. Artillery duels continue here, lancets fly, the Apu is destroyed and suppressed by artillery. Krasnopol is working, Iskanders and tornadoes are constantly arriving from, and the Afu positions are being suppressed along the channel. In the area of Zelenopolia Kurdyumovka, that is, in the direction of Dzerzhinsk-Toretsk. In other words, a very difficult, painstaking counter-battery struggle is being waged. Kleshivka is just all lined up in beer with drones, flying here constantly in such a huge amount that it's not even a pity. It feels like spending another drone even on a mock-up so that it doesn't stand once again, and the next time it doesn't bother the eye. From the completely controlled Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, nothing can either cross or come. And it is reported that due to the severity, difficulties in supplying the Afu grouping in the hours in the Yar as a whole, or rather not even for an hour in the Yar, but on the Russian side of the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass channel, the time spent by fighters at zero has increased. And if, according to the standards of being at zero for no more than 5 days, but people are sent there with rations, with BC, and you stand 4 or 5 days, you run out of bull rations, what will you do there? Well, there's nothing for you to do there. Well, it's not known what to wave there, yes, with your hands, with a white flag. Now, according to the problems with crossing the Seversky Donbass Canal, the average time spent at zero is 10 to 15 days. But again, these 10 or 15 days are just, well, it's about nothing. It's very hard, it's unbearable, and it can end up extremely sad. But the Russian army is not in a hurry, they are working. Perhaps they want to minimize the loss of personnel, simply force the APU to retreat. Or perhaps even break the psyche of individual fighters and force them to surrender, but it is the fire shaft that is used here. And the situation is extremely difficult. Seversk direction. The Russian army continues its offensive. Sources report the resumption of hostilities in the direction of Krasnogorovka, on the resumption of hostilities along the railway. And the artillery has increased, very much increased. It has intensified on the southern coverage of the disputed settlement. Artillery strikes are underway, the terrain is being prepared. It is also possible to expect the offensive of the Russian army. Let me remind you that here, among other things, the Russian army has repeatedly used the tactics of motorized assaults using motorcycles. And it has repeatedly been possible to advance along the railways. Perhaps here, among other things, we should expect some kind of possibly massive landing with the use of motorcycles. But a very interesting new approach to quality in terms of mobility, speed, and, most importantly, invisibility and efficiency. Because the tanks will start moving, they will be seen. The day before yesterday, they will still see and fly. And they will still wait for you to arrive. And the motorcycles, what will you do? I crossed the fields on bikes, landed mobile, and maybe even if you still know the map of the minefields. So it's a pleasure to cross the field 5 kilometers in a minute, land troops, quickly storm, gain a foothold, or take a tongue. Bounce until reinforcements arrive upon these. On the same blahs, or on the old becks, then there was no one here anymore, the trace of everyone was gone. And if he comes, maybe they'll pick you up again. Then the situation is really so-so. Then we are moving in the South Georgian direction, no news. Severokopinskaya is a tax-free situation, no news. The only shots for the first time in many days, weeks, the Russian army published footage of artillery strikes on Kislovka-Kotlyrovka. But maybe just regular activity, it's hardly related. Perhaps it is connected, because for a long time there was a pause, silence, then bang, and the artillery begins to arrive. Perhaps something is starting, we need to watch and wait for more information. Kharkiv direction. The Russian army published footage of the destruction, revealing the destruction of another howitzer 3 axes along the border. In Kharkiv itself, footage is published of, say, the results of another arrival, as a result of which, as you can see, an entire building was destroyed there, damaged, fragments, destruction, and so on and so forth. Then we go with you, let's look at the time of the tactical bridgehead. No news. The Georgian direction marks a small advance of the Russian army, frames, maps are published, drone strikes in Beer are published. In other words, it is gradually expanding, say, 1 building per day. The territories of control of the Russian army of the armed forces of Ukraine are gradually rolling back to the north and the northeastern part of the settlement. At the same time, there are strikes on the fields, but, let's just say, just an ordinary military routine. The Ukrainians will transfer additional reinforcements, and everything can wind back, let's say, in the opposite direction. Back and forth, let's say. It is reported that Ukrainians, let's say, in view of the arrival soon of a large package of military assistance from the British, from the Americans, have already begun to prepare for the Crimea. Drones, decoy missiles have already begun to fly back to identify air defense positions. In the coming week, such a thing will begin in the Crimea that perhaps this has never happened during a special military operation, well, from the side of the armed forces of Ukraine, which awaits us in the next few weeks. Getting ready. Well, definitely, the Russian troops see all this, they are also preparing, strikes are also being carried out on Odessa. Since it is clear that the strikes will fly them both from Odessa and from Kherson. A few cheetahs were thrown to Odessa, who work on geraniums. In other words, in general, in the near future, it will be very hot here, very hot. Kiev. Of course, the most important news is the package of military assistance, which has already been agreed in the Senate, in Congress, where Biden signed his signature, will supply Ukraine with a lot of things, but there are no tanks, there are no heavy equipment. There are light Bradleys, HIMARS missiles, there are air defense missiles, there are light Bradleys, light M113. The British in general will give almost 400 pieces of equipment. Perhaps in the near future F-16 will appear. We do not exclude it, it is quite likely. But the package is already known, it has been announced. Something outside the package may have been deceived somewhere, but we will look. In the near future, it is expected to provide for, let's say, restrictions on electricity consumption for enterprises, businesses from 5 to 10 in the evening, due to problems. According to Russian news from The Important, of course it is worth noting, this is the arrest of the Deputy Minister of Defense. Different versions. Some say they are connected with bribes, with corruption, others say that it is connected with the fact that he is accused of treason, of betrayal. Well, we are waiting for additional information. It will become clear sooner or later. Also, Russia, on the eve of the 9th of May, begins to bring all captured American equipment in large quantities. Bradley, German martyrs, Bradley are coming. All where the Leopards are in the latest modifications. That is, on the 9th of May it will be fun. People will be able to come and look at all the captured equipment. There is also information that this year, most likely, the 500 will begin to enter the Russian, let's say, the Russian army. They are able to shoot down hypersonic weapons from 500 and shoot very powerful missiles themselves. Even the Ministry of Defense published the footage. In other words, modernization is underway. And the most interesting thing is that even today, Foreign Minister Kuleba spoke in an interview about the industrial production of the Russian-American military. And he says that comparing how the moves of a special military operation, Russia managed to move far away. He expressed himself so very culturally that I have big questions. Something in the West, something is wrong. There's something wrong there. Well, I will add from myself the wrong place to think, apparently. Here is another additional technique worth lying, or rather the technique for the trophy already. But all this is already being concentrated and assembled for the parades on the 1st of the 9th of May. On Belarus today, Alexander Grigoryevich Lukashenko spoke about Zelensky, about the West, about everything. It was composed about the fact that Ukraine was torn up all its life by all the presidents, whom everyone, without exception, hated. Did not love a single one. That, in general, the Third World War is being waged on the territory of Ukraine. And so Ukraine surrendered, in fact, sold its own territory for military operations. In fact, it is already between the West and the NATO states, Russia. Belarus also really wants to involve Belarus in this war, but, well, as I understood Lukashenko's words, it will not succeed. Warsaw. There are long queues at consular centers, even those that are ready do not issue passports. And people, of course, are in despair and are already beginning to express an opinion. But why do we, Ukrainians? Well, the one that is in these centers, such a Ukraine that behaves, and behaves like this. Of course, I have a big question here. Yes, there are these problems with the centers. That's my opinion, I've been thinking about it a lot. Clearly, obviously a big loss. This is the situation with passports, which the Ukrainian authorities are now doing with immigrants, those who have left Ukraine, yes. They do not want to fight, they condemn the fighting, perhaps they are just taking care of their lives. They are more interested in material things, perhaps. You can understand them, but they don't want to die, right? They may not want to return to Ukraine, it is impossible. They want to stay in Europe forever, and so on and so forth. And here is this law, which does not allow everyone to change their passports so that they all return, and, of course, then mobilize to send them to the front. There is one thing I don't understand in this situation. Why is it that the Russian leadership does not take advantage of this simply ideal situation in any way? Of course, well, why not use it? After all, even from the point of view of minimizing the risks of mobilization, as well as many of them will be forced to return to Ukraine. This is a huge mobilization resource. Up to 900,000 people are in Europe, who, in theory, should return 900,000 to Ukraine and go straight to the front to fight. This is an entire army that is not in the country now. It is another army in reserve, then somewhere in Europe. Of course, the thoughts that I'm going to say now are absolutely delusional, but it's even banal to publicly express the opinion that according to some simplified procedures, All Ukrainians who are expiring passports should be given the same thing, under the simplified procedure of citizenship of the Russian Federation, so that they have documents for legal stay in Europe, with valid documents. Even just a phrase in the public space from the leadership of the Russian Federation can lead to the fact that this story will end as quickly as possible, and they will start making passports again for these poor Ukrainians who are abroad. But this situation is not used either. That's the big question here. I would like to observe, and perhaps in the near future, there will be some reaction and some progress on the part of the Russian leadership, in order to play here as well. This is politics. This is what is happening, what, in principle, it should do. Elements of the Cold War, elements of competition for everything else. And of course the USA. The military aid package has been approved. Old Joe signed everything that needs to be signed. We have already discussed everything that can only flow into military aid packages. And here it is, that is, a new round of war, a new escalation, and in the near future. We need to stock up on popcorn, probably, because it will be very interesting.